Okay, hello everybody. I'm very pleased to see that Himanshu, that we've actually got an audience. We thought this was probably going to be a conversation between Himanshu and I, given in the current circumstances, especially in the public administration or policymaking field, the seeming obscurity of the title, time and temporality in policymaking. So I'm very pleased to see that people are joining us, and people are continuing to join. So I will just let them in as they appear on my screen. The great pleasures of Zoom events is that we're able to arrange such meetings at short notice and across the world. Of course, the great disadvantage of such meetings is that we don't get a chance to interact physically and to speak outside of this forum. What I think, and Himanshu, you'll say something more about this shortly, we're hoping that will come out of this is the beginning of a conversation around times and temporalities in policymaking, something that will lead to further events, and then potentially a book or a special edition on the topic. You'll see, and I'll say a few words about it going forward. We think the topic is very important, both intellectually but also practically. From my perspective, at least, it offers the perspective from time and temporality. I think is associated with quite some important innovations around policy analysis, but also especially around policy making, which I will discuss in the course of my paper. So, broadly speaking, just to welcome everybody, my name is Ivor Chipkin. I'm the director of a think tank in Johannesburg called the Government and Public Policy Think Tank. Hoping some of my other colleagues will be joining us during the course of the session. Himanshu Burt, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure most of you do know, is an associate professor at the Center for Urban Science and Engineering at the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay. He's a practicing architect, which is how he and I met. I now understand from Mandini that it's 18 years ago, because when we first met very briefly, their first child had just been born. I was in India using my father's name to speak to architecture students. I'm the son of an architect rather than actual architect myself, on a tour of India. And I think, Himanshu, this is the first time that we actually have we're actually doing something together from a work perspective. So Himanshu's worked and practiced as an architect in Goa. He's published across the professional, popular and academic press for almost 30 years. In several books, Urban Parallax, Parallacy in the City in Contemporary India, as well as Space for Engagement, the Indian Art Place and a Habitational Approach to Architecture. His research interests include urban transformation, sustainable urbanization, and the critical practice of architecture in India. I, in contrast, I'm not an architect or an urbanist per se. Although, as I mentioned earlier, I'm the son of an architect, architectural historian actually. For my sins, I think I identify myself today as a public administration scholar, although I have a French theoretical training. Most recently, I've been caught up in South Africa in the struggle and analysis of what's come to be known in South Africa as state capture, a large phenomenon of what I regard as politically driven violence and corruption, which is ongoing, and which we're still suffering the effects of. But my interest in institutions and on time and temporality comes out of my deep and profound concern, which I share with Himanshu, on how does one make policy in the current circumstances and build institutions that are capable of delivering that policy. So the way in which today is going to work is that Himanshu is going to present his paper. I will then present a paper, and we will then open up for a discussion. Himanshu, are there anything that you want to say before I hand over to you?
No, so we can just start, and maybe 10 minutes each, 10 to 15 at most, each of us, and then we respond to each other. I think that we'll say have some comments for each other after both of us present, and then we open it to the
Okay, super. So the broad context, especially from the South African point of view, and I think in India as well, is a context where there is increasing skepticism around the very prospect of government and the very prospect of making policy. In globally, the field of governance has emerged, which has called into question the purposeful character of institutions and their ability to act in a way that is both fair, transparent, democratic, and ultimately that is even capable of achieving or performing on their own policies. So I think a growing skepticism, and especially in contexts which are democratic like South Africa and in India. So in the South African context, we've had nearly 30 years of ANC rule. It is associated with tremendous unevenness of government performance, but increasingly the sense is that ANC rule from a governance point of view, from a government point of view, is a failure. Tremendous failures in everyday life. We're living almost daily with massive electricity cuts from failures in policy around electricity generation and electricity transmission, in health, in education, in many large sectors, including security as well. Tremendous failures of policy and of government performance. So it's raised the question of what is going wrong in the South African context. I think in India it's similar. But associated with that is a crisis of democracy, an increasing attraction of authoritarian models. In South Africa, for example, the Chinese model has a prestige which is quite astonishing, especially in government circles, and especially in policy-making circles, and especially amongst those who are in public administration. And I think it's testimony to the idea that there is something wrong with democracy when it comes to governance, and yet authoritarian models potentially have solutions. So both a failure in terms of policy making, but also potentially a failure of democracy. And this is why I think this particular conversation is an urgent one and necessarily a comparative one. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Himanshu.
So thank you, Ivor. It's really a pleasure to be back in conversation after 18 years. And, it's the topic of time and temporality, and especially the way the corner of the ring that I am going to really hold up is very apt for the way even this event happened. This discussion has got organized because it's really an accident in every sense of the term. A happy accident where I would just a few weeks ago uploaded his recent paper he wrote with Yelena, which I happened to read, and then I wrote back to him saying, see, I've also been thinking about temporality, and so it's really by chance that something like this has happened, and that is relevant as a framing for this conversation, because we see this genuinely as a kind of kickoff, as identifying certain points of departure, and certainly not as a kind of consolidation or closing of insight or God forbid theory. So let me begin by linking and taking off from Ivor's concern about, or Ivor's, the picture Ivor painted of the crisis of both democracy as well as of everyday, of the most basic level of efficiency. And the great urban planning planner and theorist Kevin Lynch has this very useful and tacit dialectic that he sets up between justice and efficiency, and which is of course repeated in different ways across the literature. And I think in many ways this is the dialectic that we are always, I think, grappling with, whether we are thinking spatially or temporally. And I should also add a bit more about the need to speak about how I have found myself moving towards the temporal. As Ivor mentioned, I'm an architect by training, and as we all know very well, architects have always thought of space, at least for the last 100 years, as a kind of as a physical dimension, really, which inhabits an empty eternity in temporal terms. And I began to think about policy and planning about 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, coming at it from Henri Lefebvre's critique of abstract space. And of course, the abstraction in general. And I was very taken by the power of abstract structures and abstract constructs, whether it is the construct of institutional structure, for instance, or even the constitution of a democratic country, right down to the plans and the geometries of physical spaces. And as I began to recognize the interweaving of what is conventionally distinguished from space as time, as I began to see the inseparability, but the distinguishability, as Lefebvre puts it, of space and time, I realized that there isn't much systematic thinking about the temporal dimension. We've had a spatial turn some decades ago, and the temporal dimension is, of course, there all through the social sciences in everything at a slightly submerged level, but it's not perhaps being adequately lifted up to scrutiny. And it was from that with that sentiment that I began to think more systematically about the temporality, especially of urban policy. And so we have put the links for both Ivar's and my papers in the chat for those of you who may want to download these and read them later after the event. So my paper, which was a part of a book that I co-edited with a colleague, Amita Bhide. The book was called Urban Parallax. And the paper was called Out of Time, Policy Temporality and Urban Process. So as the title makes clear, the key concern of the paper is the connection between real historical time, real time as we know it, as we inhabit it, and as we then reconstruct sometimes as history. So on the one hand, this real time and the time that and then what I suspected was an abstract time which policy inhabits. Right? And this abstract time, interestingly, is you could say a correlate or a kind of component of the abstract space that Henri Lefebvre speaks about. But I won't go into that very much, but this is only as a way of placing this this inquiry within a broader frame. So I took the key argument that I have tried to develop with the help of a particular case about which I'll speak a little more as I go on, was that for the temporality that policy, and I'm more familiar with urban policy, that the temporality that is implicit to and implicitly central, and which organizes the structure of urban policy, is linear and necessarily almost ahistorical. And it is what I call its, if you want to call it its logic, is an algorithmic logic. And that's, of course, the logic of bureaucracy, right? And on the other hand, real real time, the time of the social world, is something very different. It is not necessarily organized around any particular law or logic, as we well know. It is not bereft of that logic. So while trying to look for some kind of characterization of this particular time, I came across this very interesting paper by William Sewell, which is called Three Temporalities. Is, I think, published in the late 1980s for the first time. And Sewell proposes, and he's a historical sociologist, and he looks back at various histories and the theory and the theoretical structure that is intrinsic to various historical accounts. And he argues that he sees three different temporalities, three models of time along which they are constructed. One, he argues, one he calls a teleological temporality, in which the historian writes backward in time, constructing history as if it would inevitably lead to a particular moment that that has already happened. In other words, history is seen to be destined because of various logics that can be read back into it to lead to the present that the historian is talking about. The other temporality he discerns in the literature is what he calls an experimental temporality, and that's a very, very interesting term. He gives the example of Theda Skocpol, if I'm not massacring her name, who's written about three revolutions: the French, the Russian, and the Chinese, and who effectively treats them as independent and coeval or equivalent. And she's trying. In Sewell's account, she explains them in terms of some so-called, scientific, eternal, ahistorical logics. And of course, he finds each of the teleological and the experimental temporalities as having obvious problems, where the teleological temporality takes little account of the unpredictability, the chance-like character of history, where at every point of inflection, if you want to call it that, things could go many different directions. But because you know what has already happened, you, in a sense, force fit the account or the explanation to what you know has already happened in a particular way. Whereas the experimental temporality in the account of the three revolutions fails to account for the fact that each had an effect on the subsequent revolution, that they were actually even there was actually contact between actors across at least the Russian and the Chinese revolutions. And so history, the accumulated force of history and momentums, is something that is missed. In other words, path dependence is missed in the experimental. And in opposition to these two, he offers an outline of eventful temporality, in which history matters, the direction that has already been set in motion in the past through various events, but it doesn't determine the outcomes the way perhaps some natural laws might. But, and there is also, at the same time, a openness to various ruptures, to various multiple different directions that events can go, that trajectories can go in because of the power of events. And those events, there is an independent literature on events, which I myself not really be engaged with. But the disruptive power of events is something that he takes on board and argues that we need to approach history in this way, to recognize and account for this nature, this unpredictable, random, chance-like, and yet pattern in some way, kind of nature of all social process. And I found this very interesting when I took these three models of temporality and looked at one particular policy moment in the state of Maharashtra, where I live in India. And this is the Gunthevari Act. Gunthevaris are unauthorized layouts, a form which is it's a genre of development that is common across the world, but takes many different particular forms. And there was we had this kind of explosion of these Gunthevaris, or unauthorized layouts across Maharashtra, where in many cities, small, medium scale cities, a third to the half the population was living in these Gunthevaris, and the crisis was that there was no legal structure within which they could be recognized, because they didn't fall into the legal category of the slum, and therefore they could not be provided services, and so on and so forth. What is interesting for this discussion and what was the focus of my paper was really the what we could understand about the way time was acknowledged and acted on in or modeled in this particular policy response. So what the Gunthevari Act did was it instituted a cutoff date, beyond which point all of these all the unauthorized layouts that had occurred up to a certain point would be regularized, would be kind of taken under the law and accepted, provided some fees were paid and so on, some compliance was completed, and other, so the conditions were themselves very interesting, and I've gone into some detail about what worked and didn't, and so on and so forth. But in principle, it sought to dam the flow of time of a process that already had a momentum and was building across the state. Maharashtra state has today about 125 million people, so it's bigger than many countries, and this was already widespread across the state. So it hoped, by the sheer logic and of course the power, legal power behind the act, it hoped to simply dam the momentum that was already on the ground, and said that if more Gunthevaris emerged after 2001, they would not simply be they would be demolished or something terrible like that was at least promised. Interestingly, we have had a history of many such temporal dams, which of course are simply lifted and pushed further ahead, and so on and so forth, which itself was for me a starting point. The fact that there is this fiction of this dam, of a cutoff, which is then constantly moved, which told me, and this is about beyond from before Gunthevari, from other domains. Now, what was particularly interesting in the way this played out was, on the one hand, the act, to go back to Sewell's idea of the three temporalities, the act in its preamble actually acknowledged the eventfulness or the eventful history that was powering the Gunthevaris. The fact that a complex conjuncture of previous policies, certain market conditions, poverty, etc., was together forcing people, the working poor, to actually opt for this form. So it recognized the historical force of this phenomena. And it even acknowledged tacitly the role of policy or the failure of policy in enabling this particular dynamic. But interestingly, the policy design itself simply occupied the opposite temporality, which was mainly experimental, but as I've argued, also had a teleological component to it. So what this leaves me with is a fascination, you might say, between a fascination for the contradictions intrinsic to policy design, which it takes on sometimes without acknowledging it, without even being conscious of this contradiction, between an acknowledgement of historical eventful temporality, which policy inhabits in its real political avatar in the social kind of flux. But on the inside of policy design, there is simply no possibility of designing with or for this historical temporality. And this is a contradiction that, on the one hand, it's not an illegitimate contradiction, okay? And it's not also an automatically solvable contradiction, perhaps, and hopefully we will have a conversation. This would be something that Ivor and I could engage on further. So this contradiction, to my mind, is also is at heart a contradiction between history and theory, or history and logic, and you could also cast it as a contradiction between the force of practice, social practice out there, and that of say policy logic, with very strong arguments and real force that can be found on either side. So that hopefully gives you all a sense of the argument that I was trying to make through that paper, and perhaps also lays the ground for the discussion to come. So Ivor, I am done. Maybe you can take over for your paper.
Manchu, thank you very much. And I think what I've really enjoyed about this presentation and your work is that there are a whole lot of things I haven't heard. So in the South African context especially, but I think more widely, when one is talking about these sorts of contradictions, as you call them, we hear other kinds of explanations, one which take us quite far away from the policy process itself. So in the South African context, for example, we hear quite frequently that government failures are attributed as a result of neoliberalism. So that's one of the major tropes of explanation and of critique. We have a government that has pursued policies and strategies in the framework of a neoliberal macroeconomic policy, and that is the explanation for a whole range of failures. Now, the analysis may be broadly correct, but the causalities between those failures and neoliberalism is seldom adequately explained. The other trope, which is especially compelling in the South African context, but I think internationally as well, is around corruption. Now, of course, I've been doing a lot of work in this space, so it's something I'm very familiar with. But again, it's a sense that that the policy failure is essentially driven by morally corrupt, morally poor people who are looting money for their own purposes. In South Africa, we often use the term repurposing institutions. Sometimes that's regarded as a moral failure. Sometimes it's regarded as a part of a political dynamic, kind of machine-like politics of South Africa, where state resources are, rents are appropriated from government contracts in order to pay for, to subsidize political networks, and in particular those of the African National Congress. And of course, the third trope, and these all often go together, is around technical problems of skills. So we often lament in South Africa the weakness of, or the lack of skills in the South African context around to pursue policy. But what is seldom studied or scrutinized in and of itself is the policy process itself, and the degree to which the policy process itself lends itself to failure or to success. So what I've really enjoyed about Himanshu's work, and this is possibly the basis of the cooperation in the seminar, is again as an interest on policy and policy making itself as a contributor to the success or failure of government initiatives. Now, and this is really what I want to focus on, especially around the temporal dimensions of it. So I want to come back to Himanshu's concept, because I think he's introduced a whole range of terms very nicely for me. Teleological time, experimental time, real time. And potentially it shows up as well the point of divergence between us. Just muting, I think that's muting everybody. Because I think there are areas of disagreement or potential disagreement between us that I think we should state up front. From what I understand about Himanshu's perspective, is essentially the contradiction he's discussing is the difference between real time, the temporality of life as it happens in reality, and the necessary temporality of the policy process, which is either teleological or experimental. And the sense that these temporalities are by definition in contradiction, and that goes a long way to explain the contradiction between them. So I want to take that critique as given. I think that's an important critique, but I want to draw the consequences of it. Because what it seems to suggest is that under any circumstances, government actions are doomed to failure, or deemed at least to a fundamental or a large separation or gap between policy intention and policy implementation. Now, that might be generally true, but I want to argue that under certain circumstances, it is possible to narrow that gap. In other words, it is possible, especially in the context of democracies, to produce administrations which are able to, under certain circumstances, to more or less achieve their goals. If they can't do that, well, then I think the democratic project, especially in our context, is largely unlikely to be realized. So my starting point then in this intervention is to argue that democracy is not just a political system. It's not just a system around how the popular will is established, who gets to decide, who gets to participate in decision-making and how those decisions are made. But I want to argue essentially that democracy is also about a system of government. It's about translating popular decisions or popular will into actual actions on the ground. So again, not just a political system which aggregates political wishes and political demands, but a system which is also able to translate those demands into practices on the ground. And what that means is therefore that a necessary component of democracy is government, and in particular government in relationship to administration and implementation. So public policy, therefore, is a fundamental aspect of democracy and democratization, and we have to admit that up front. Our problem is that our preoccupation, as far as I can see it, especially in South Africa, but I think more generally, is that our preoccupation with democracy is really as a system of deciding and determining the popular will. So now we get into some, I think, some quite areas of some degree of discontent when it comes to democracy, because generally speaking, democracy, historically speaking, is regarded as not particularly good or accomplished at administration. And there's a long history of this. If you read de Tocqueville, for example, de Tocqueville in America, he's profoundly skeptical of democracies to actually build effective administrations. He's much more on the side of monarchies in this regard. Monarchies are able to aggregate wills, determine policies rather effectively, and then they have a tradition or a history of building administrations which are able then to implement them. Democracy, and he's especially concerned about America, the prospect of a monarchy ultimately going to war and defeating America, precisely because he's unsure that democracies have the ability to generate capable administrations able to implement their will. This is not just an idiosyncratic view of de Tocqueville. You'll see this in Woodrow Wilson as well. Woodrow Wilson, again, is also deeply skeptical of the ability of democracies per se to build effective administrations. And again, his great concern is, again, in the American situation, about developing a body of scholarship to assist America as a democracy to build an effective administration. But even as recently, in contemporary times, John Donne remains profoundly skeptical of the ability of democracies to build effective administrations. I mean, we know, for example, he's most well known. Democracy is established in places, he argues, where good governments already existed, not because they created them, but because they inherited them. And of course, for people like us, from those of us in the global South and in South Africa or in India and elsewhere, where we don't have a tradition of inheriting established institutions, the prospect of building a capable state in democratic conditions then presents itself as a very powerful and worrying problem. And as I mentioned right at the beginning of my talk, the experience of democratic government in South Africa is really a story of in many respects, a story of government failure. Of course, and I'll say a little bit more about this later, there have been some moments of tremendous success in the early 1990s and up to the early 2000s of successful state building in the South African context. But generally, over the last 20 years, especially, there has been a lot of that good work has been undone. And generally speaking, in all the major policy areas, we have a situation of decaying and collapsing state institutions. So, how do we understand this peculiar democratic failure, or the great democratic difficulty of establishing effective and successful administrations? So I think Himanshu helps us a lot explaining and introducing a temporal vocabulary to our analysis. I think it's a vocabulary which resonates very strongly with a literature emerging from the perspective of governance literature, which again calls into question and raises profound doubts about the contradictory temporalities of government, bureaucracy and administration, serial, slow, linear, based on a certain conception of planning and of expected results, coming into fierce, often violent conflict with the temporality of what Himanshu has called the temporality of the real, rapid, contradictory, unexpected, multiple, simultaneous, where things do not unfold in any linear or predictable manner, and you have these these multiple temporalities coming into profound conflict and producing, in the end, what we might describe as policy failure, or what in South Africa is sometimes called the implementation gap, the great distance between the policy intention and what is produced on the ground. So in the work of Achille Mbembe, for example, Achille Mbembe is based at the University of the Witwatersrand, the Cameroonian philosopher. He argues that essentially what is described in the governance literature, what Himanshu has called the time of the real, he argues that this is essentially the signature of the post-colonial situation. So he defines the post-colonial situation as defined or marked by a particular post-colonial time, which he calls the time of temporariness. And what is its characteristics? It's, as we've discussed, it's the time of non-linearity, of time moving very, very fast and then suddenly slowing down, of unexpected events, of multiple simultaneous temporalities coming into conflict, and in that result, he suggests, although he doesn't develop the idea too far, in that environment, institutions struggle to develop presence and to establish themselves. So the example he uses in one of his essays, that in that context it becomes very difficult for organizations to keep their records and to develop the most basic administrative practices. So Achille Mbembe defines that as the time of the post-colonial, but I think in the way Himanshu's defined it, we might define it as the time of the real per se. So if it is true, which I believe it is, this challenge of implementation, this challenge of moving beyond policy intention, but actually producing effects in the ground, this challenge of government is the challenge of government per se, is also a challenge of democracy. If the governance literature or Himanshu skepticism is correct, then I think we have to recognize that these raises profound questions about the prospect of democracy in post-colonial situations and the prospect of democracy generally. It's why I think it's especially urgent that we find a way of dealing with the temporality of the real and reconciling it to the temporality of government. And Himanshu, let us come back to this discussion about whether teleological and experimental time are necessarily irreconcilable to the time of the real. I'm actually quite favorable to what you call experimental time, and what I will talk about in a moment as operational time, or the time of the machine. So I think there is a way of overcoming these tensions, and the way of doing it is to draw from a perspective which is largely absent in the philosophical literature and is largely absent in the governance literature, and that is a focus on institutions, to think around the temporality, not of society, in general, some abstract conception of the temporality of the real, but to think around the social time in relationship to the time of institutions. Government necessarily is built on institutions which are then activated or mobilized in the service of its intentions. So what is key, is a key player in this regard, is to understand organizations and their particular modes of being. And I want to argue that these institutions have particular temporalities of their own, and that we can and must measure those temporalities, because it's in that measuring and understanding the temporality of organizations that we can potentially overcome the tension between the time of government and the time of the real. So those that have been that have paid a lot of attention to these questions, which we in the social sciences and the humanities and even in public administration have not paid as much attention to, it's in the business literature. Business sciences, business schools spend a lot of time and have thought a lot around the mechanics of running and operationalizing businesses and business corporations. And part of those considerations are on the temporality of businesses and organizations. And of course, most famous in that respect is the work of F.W. Taylor, who really radicalized and pioneered the analysis of time when it came to organizations. So his study, for example, of the worker and his extremely authoritarian views of constraining and of disciplining the body of the worker in relationship to their particular tasks, nonetheless opened up an entire field of analysis, often associated with Fordism, around organizing business operations in the achievement of their particular tasks. What I think is important, though, around the work of F.W. Taylor and necessary for our purposes, especially around thinking of institutions and managing temporality, is his argument essentially that the time of the real, the time of capitalism, the time of production, can be somehow brought under control if one can discipline the time of organizations. So I think that's an incredibly important insight, and applied to the field of public administration or government, I think it potentially opens up the field. What it asks us to do in the field of governance and in the field of public administration, it asks us to think very seriously around the form of institutions and the temporality of institutions. Himanshu, I think I'm running out of time, but if I do have a few more seconds, I'd like to show you some work that I've been doing in relationship to South African institutions, and in particular our public enterprise responsible for the generation and distribution of electricity. It's and let me see if I can bring up a screen. So what I've done, if you can see in these, so the company in particular is called Eskom, Energy Supply Corporation. It's responsible, as I've said, for the generation and the distribution of electricity in South Africa. Over the last 15, 20 years, it has been a site of the most terrible contestation, including of capture, where huge amounts of its resources were accrued as criminal rents, either to politicians or to businessmen. And in that context, broadly speaking, electricity generation in South Africa has suffered terribly, so that we are faced constantly with shocking power outages on a regular basis. What I've done is I've modeled the temporality of the organization to see whether it is associated with the declining in performance. And I want to show you just a couple of them. So one is, these are time series analysis. So this shows a decline, but not a shocking decline of engineers in Eskom.
Ivor?
Yes.
Can you make it full screen?
Yes. I can. Let me just.
Thanks.
So what I've been trying to understand is the general modeling the temporality of the organization in relationship to the general decline of its performance. So I've tried to model several hypotheses. One of them is that what you saw was, as I mentioned right at the beginning, is a general deterioration in the skills in the company. Part of that, a general discourse around that what explains policy failure is a decline of skills, especially an analysis which is especially robust in the South African context. So what I did was I modeled over time changes in the number of and seniority of engineers within Eskom over the period. The period of real catastrophe in Eskom starts around 2010 up to around 2017. So this period here. And what you'll see is there definitely was a decline in the number of engineers. It settles, and then even at the time most associated with the decline of Eskom's performance, the number of engineers actually improves. When you look more clearly at their skills, what you note was a tremendous increase in the number of MBAs in the Eskom management. Let me not say too much more about that, but it does show the growing influence of business schools in the training of senior management in South Africa, which I think is an international phenomenon. This is an analysis of the number of those implicated in corruption rising to senior positions in Eskom, and at the key period of decline, there's definitely a rise in the percentage or the proportion of people implicated in corruption in the senior management of Eskom. So that argument around the temporality of corruption as being a key factor in Eskom's decline is clearly an important one, but I don't think it's a major one. What I think is much more important is the general temporality of the organization. So what this is here, this is an analysis of the heads of key technical or operational divisions and how long they're in their position. In other words, it's an analysis of staff turnover in the technical divisions. Each bar represents a year. So this is what you'll see here initially is that there's some staff turnover at the democratic transition. There's further turnover in the late 1990s, but then there's a long period of stability. The period of real Eskom decline is associated with tremendous, astonishing, chronic instability or turnover of the senior management in technical divisions, and this is where I think we really start to see things. So this is where I want to end. This is a temporal analysis of Eskom over the last since 1990, so over the last 3 decades. What it shows, and this is based on time series maths, where we're using the notion of temporality and using the notion of stationary and non-stationary data series. So we modeled the stationarity of the time series, and what we'll find is that the period prior to 2008, the graph is relatively stationary. In other words, these changes of the stability of the senior management, these turnover changes have a fairly regular pattern, regular and predictable pattern. The time associated with the real decline of Eskom's performance is the time when, if you like, in the language of Hamlet, time becomes out of joint. In other words, the temporal sequence becomes massively non-linear, unpredictable, chronically unstable. It is like, if you like, it's in the language of Himanshu, it becomes the temporality of the real. And this is, my mind, associated with the chronic decline of the organization. So let me end on a note here. I believe it is possible to overcome this contradiction or this tension between the time of the real and the time of policy making if one is able to focus on organizations themselves, and if one is able to bring the organizations themselves into a temporal framework which is not that of the real itself. Let me end there. Himanshu.
Thank you, Ivor. So it was really great to see those graphs again, and I think you identified the distinction and also the possible, which could be a kind of bone of contention or an axis of disagreement, quite correctly. And I'm going to respond to that by saying that, I actually agree with the point you ended with, which is that I think if one has to be even minimally optimistic, one has to believe that these different times can be aligned in a meaningful way, right? And it is very helpful. The three causalities or three arguments for policy failure that you presented from the literature, the one about neoliberalism, corruption, and skills, I think you're absolutely right that they miss something more fundamental. And I think if we were to, we were to focus on really the core challenge, which is of bringing different times together, the time of logic, the time of logic in terms of logic of effectiveness and not just efficiency. The word efficiency is very easy to attack, and rightfully so, in the current neoliberal climate, but there's also, it comes with the goal of effectiveness, right? And I think we need, so I think we're agreed that if we have to have any effective practice, we need these two times to be managed together. And if at all there is a contradiction, then I think it's useful to think what is the nature of that contradiction, and whether it's a contradiction which is of the kind that is a kind of paradox where it is not resolvable to completely two things which cannot come together, or is it a contradiction which is more dialectical, in which there is a tension but which actually is productive. And I do see this as really a dialectical contradiction. And I mean, we don't have to be trapped in some orthodox conceptualization of the dialectical contradiction, but keeping it relatively loose and nimble here. And even I don't believe that we need to take Sewell's three temporalities as completely distinct or ever present in their pure form, and therefore being necessarily in a kind of exclusionary contradiction in relation to each other. So there is, of course, a scope, but I think the key question, one key question, if we are to stick to the goal of, say, democracy and justice, etc., is what is involved in operational time becoming dominant. Okay? Because on the one hand, it's dominance internal to the organization, which is really what a business studies or I think a public administration examination would first be concerned with, and which is the stuff of your argument, really, the focus of your argument. I think that is one kind of consideration, and even there we know the critiques of Taylorism and the violence that can be caused internally. But there's in addition the relationship with that operational time of as it is practiced by that institution and the social world outside. And in the case of public policy and governance institutions, I think that is where I'm sure in both India, South Africa, but even more widely in the post-colonial world, I think we feel the violence and the bite much more sharply. So I think that perhaps negotiating that relation between inside and outside on the one hand, and bringing in politics into a more productive conversation with the policy design is perhaps a path.
So Himanshu, thank you. I mean, I love this idea of a dialectical contradiction, one that is productive and in certain moments can be reconciled. Because I think if one departs from such a sensibility, I think one is departing from the democratic imaginary. One is giving up on the prospect of democracy, especially as not just as a system that aggregates political or social demands and somehow yes, aggregates them, but as a system of government moving beyond the aggregation of demands to the realization of desires and wishes. So I think that the very prospect of democracy requires that this is a dialectical relationship rather than one that can never be resolved. So once one focuses on institutions, I think this question of operational time. And I'd be interested to hear how it relates to what you call experimental time. I think it becomes particularly important once one is thinking around the ways in which disciplining an organization or disciplining an institution, disciplining the people in an organization around a particular imperative, a particular policy, a particular purpose, a particular goal. Then I think we can start opening up the question about how we do that. I mean, in South Africa, and I definitely know this because I was involved in those conversations in India, like happened in South America during the time just before the Lulu government and the PT and during the PT. There were all sorts of experiments in disciplining organizations according to operational time, which took its cue from democratic practice. So I know that I was involved in South Africa, but also in Porto Alegre, for example, and other places of developing systems of administration that were fundamentally participatory and democratic, precisely not to overcome, precisely to relate the purpose of government, the purpose of administrations with the purpose of the social, so that one could produce not to substitute the one with the other, but to produce some kind of what you've called a dialectic between those two. It seems to me that in the last 20 years, especially in South Africa, but I think more generally, and in India definitely the case, we are not having those conversations anymore, and it seems to be there's a profound skepticism about the very possibility of such a dialectical reconciliation between those two. And as a result, my worry is that the victory of kind of post-colonial philosophy and decolonial philosophy has taken us further away from asking very practical questions about how we potentially can reconcile these temporalities, and therefore to privilege questions around institutions. And as a result, by fiat, we have conceded huge terrain to arguments which ultimately make authoritarian governance seem especially attractive, precisely because they do seem to be able to make trains run more effectively on time than democracies do.
Of course, the good news, and I think you put it very, very well, though I would pick a bone and point out that the good news is that authoritarian democracies don't necessarily, we are discovering, have things happen smoothly, right? Efficiency also takes quite a hit. So in case we are, there's anyone really wanting to argue that very, very forcefully, there is enough evidence now. But I think this is very, very productive, the way you framed it. And I just want to add that I think, so participation is clearly the way ahead. And what it is important, consistent with our focus right now on the workings of the institution and of processes, it is important to recognize the mechanism through which at the level of temporality, what participation implies, or how it might actually engineer that kind of joining of different temporalities in a productive conversation is something which I think we probably do not acknowledge enough, which is that the temporalities of organizations and of societies are actually a compound of temporalities of agency, of diverse agency, and diverse agencies in conversation, in conflict, basically bouncing off each other, working together. And participation in whatever specific design is really a way, I see, of making space for those different agencies, which tomorrow are also involved within the larger temporal regime. A lovely phrase that we have come up with in your paper. They constitute the larger temporal regime within which operational time must, or with and within which operational time must operate, right? So that is the kind of mechanism in temporal terms that participation actually enacts, right? Okay, so it's almost an hour, Ivor, since we've come on stage. So should we now open it up to the audience? Yeah, unless you have something.
Let's happily exit the stage.
Yes.
So can we hand over to the general audience? All your mics are off, but that's easy to. I think you can unmute yourselves on your own, or I can do it. So, are there any? Does anybody want to have anything to say? And it doesn't have to be a question directed at us. It could be a comment. It could be an intervention. It could be a question. We open the field to whatever anybody wants. I think we've got that initial awkwardness of no one wanting to go first.
Yeah. And 1 hour of history, right? Of 2 people on stage.
I should say that my colleague in writing the paper, Jelena Vidojevic, is not available. She wasn't able to join us, but this is her work. And I think what's been so productive about the work is thinking these questions. Jelena is from former Yugoslavia, which, of course, not a post-colonial situation in any ordinary sense, but one which has come through the most astonishing civil war, where we are finding these points of comparison between the post-colonial and post-socialist, especially compelling, those points of attraction, and something related to the character of South African and Serbian institutions, which speaks something around a shared temporality. There are also a whole range of other empirical links. Organized crime, the temporality of organized crime in relation to governance is something else which we're finding very important. But also this kind of global discourse of Marxism and of socialism, we're finding very important understanding of a whole range of practices, especially in relation with African National Congress, which has been in alliance with the Communist Party, and many of its key conceptions of South Africa are drawn from an international Marxist vocabulary. So again, we have no one's wanted. Anthony, can I pick on you? Anthony Butler, I can see that you're there. I know that you had some very important comments on an early version of Jelena and my paper. Is there anything, do you have any perspective? Sorry to pick on you. And Anthony's based in the Cape, and as always, there's a particularly beautiful part of the Cape.
Can you hear me, Ivor?
Yeah.
You know, I actually don't have any questions. I enjoyed it very much, and I really enjoyed the paper, but I'm not sure I have any Any questions that would contribute particularly to your discussion? I mean, the one thought that I had was about how widely applicable this kind of analysis might be to different sorts of institutions.
Well, I mean, I'm hoping that we're making, as bold as it sounds, a universal claim that I think in all circumstances, the temporality of institutions matter, and how we model that temporality or understand that temporality is absolutely key. We're not arguing. I don't think the argument, Himanshu, I don't think you suggested anything like this, that there is, if you like, a homogeneous temporality associated with policymaking. In other words, that if one can divine somehow the right speed or the right temporal regime for a ideal type of institution, this is what we should be pursuing in every circumstance. That's not the argument at all. We're arguing that every situation has their own temporality, and how one resolves it is essentially, I mean, I love Himanshu's expression, is dialectical in that proper sense of contradiction moving towards reconciliation and a higher synthesis. So contested, contradictory, but ultimately dialectical. So in the South African circumstances, what an answer would be would depend on the environment, but it would also be very, very different to other environments.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, I think the claim really is more universal than simply, it's certainly not a kind of special pleading for either India, South Africa, or even in the so-called post-colonial states. I would, in fact, I think it is very useful to look at, say, American history, or even the recent history, and look at histories of institutions through this kind of temporal framing, and see how the invasion of the White House, for instance, happened, right? And see it in its proper temporal kind of structure or chronology, if you want to call it that. And I think this is something that I really want to resist any kind of interpretation that would seek to keep this in a safely post-colonial global South kind of corner.
Yeah, I mean, my worry is that the post-colonial or the decolonial literature seems to be preoccupied essentially with the temporality of disruption, of undoing. And what that does is that the practice of government, or the practice of government, suddenly seems to be a profoundly conservative enterprise, as if building regularity, as if regularity itself, predictability, the very existence of institutions becomes allied to a conservative or conservative political instinct. So I think in the current circumstances, decolonial, post-colonial literatures, but also politics, tend to bracket the institutional as something something that is unwarranted and unwanted. And I think we need to challenge those assertions. I don't think that I think the possibility of progressive politics requires that we think about institutions, that we think about government, that we think about bureaucracy. And so I would critique myself in one sense. I think there might not be a universal temporality, but I do think history has shown us that the time of bureaucracy, hierarchical, the time of the rule, the time of administration, for example, is a very, very potent form of organization, one especially potent for realizing government mandates. And I do therefore think that there might not be a universal temporality which applies in all circumstances, but I think history has shown that the time of administration, the time of bureaucracy, is a particularly compelling temporality when it comes to government.
I would just add, Ivor, I think it might well be, as often happens in the way literature changes direction, or the ups and downs of prestige around positions in the literature, it might well be that what you're seeing as a kind of attack on regularity, all of that, may simply be a shift in emphasis, a kind of corrective. And that's how I choose to read it, because exactly that one cannot do away with the good parts, if you want to call it, of, say, the regularity of bureaucracy and so on and so forth. And yet one can't also ignore, say, the temporal violence that may result from operational time being fully dominant, right? And that's where we are talking about participation, etc. So I think this is how I would qualify our position, at least as I understand it. And of course, it's an evolving position. Okay, I'm done. Gerard, were you trying to say something?
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name is Gerard Sundaresh. I teach at the Department of Geography at the London School of Economics. I mean, thanks, Malini, for inviting me for this. In fact, I didn't know about it, in fact, so it was great. I did my major work actually on planning violation, the same question that Himanshu has been raising, that I asked why is there so much violations in Bangalore despite the elaborate planning, implementation, and enforcement institutions. Now, this question can be asked on land use planning, can be asked on education, it can be asked on many things in many parts of the world, of course. And I mean, of course, I'm not a historian of public administration, but I think what I'm hearing from both of you from different parts of the country, one part of the country I know very well, one part I don't, which is South Africa, is that, I mean, the question emerges in the context of a mismatch between expectation and its outcome, rolling out of that expectation and outcome. Now the question is, first of all, why should there be an expectation? And second of all, what is the nature of these infrastructures of this expectation? And the infrastructure of this expectation is fundamentally colonial. These are colonial institutions organized around particular mode of arranging things, rearranging things, and its foundational assumption was all of us are unable to govern ourselves. We didn't have any framework, and all that which was going on, of course there were issues, incapable, and of course there was no knowledge, and so on and so forth, as all of us know that whole conversation. And no wonder in many ways that the moment non-democratic modes of performative capacities takes it over, that the train run, because exactly these are organized around that. Now, that is, at some point, I think we'll have to take that very seriously, because otherwise it is always about implementation failures, corruption, informality, and so on and so forth. The neoliberal informality, or the machinistic implementation gaps or failures, or the moralistic corruption and whatnot, right? And the moment you shift the normative from that, these concepts on which these are explained are untenable. There isn't an implementation gap possible if we challenge policy implementation, enforcement, temporality itself. Why should some people be capable of writing policy and others only capable of enforcement? And why are social science capable of, in fact, identifying capabilities between inputs and outputs, and so on and so forth? This is all a certain arrangement of things that we have to take serious the post-colonial critique. Now the question from that is to think about what does democracy involve. Now, if we keep on with the democracy as an idea that people just vote and enable these experts and elites and all of them to do things, it is not at all in any way transforming the arrangement of things. The arrangement is the same. right? Now, the question is, why should that arrangement work? And this is where the point that Himanshu raised about, dialectic. Well, I'm not a dialectician. I don't like Hegelian dialectics, but the simple one in which Himanshu said it's nimble, and the way he's talking about is the interaction. Now, what we can see, if you study in India, and I'll share my paper on that, Himanshu knows this, is that the nature of the formal is continuously transformed beyond recognition. There isn't a bureaucracy as we know. There is no transfer of information from one point to the other. The file passing from one desk to the another desk is a different file, and from that point till the end is a different file. And the people who are operating the files are intervening in the file in many ways. If you think about beyond a kind of a larger global conversation, people who are more sensible here is Lipsky. Early Aaron Wildavsky's critique on policy itself, as a policy process and so on, or Lipsky's street bureaucrat, if you're interested in the American and other stories. But we don't really need it, because what we see is everybody is capable of exercising their agency, and that is a democratic possibility. That would not have been possible in the original colonial system, because of course there was a belief, and of course it's forced, but also belief in the notion of the greatness that is given through the colonial modes of arrangements, right? And so of course we know today, I have so many interviews of bureaucrats saying, we are not able to implement because we are a developing country, as if, right? If we become developed, we can be more rationally organizable bureaucracy. Now, the point I'm trying to say here is that it is in I see possibility in the decolonial, not just critique. Decolonial is not a critique to me. I see possibility in the decolonial emergence of full transformation of these systems actually through challenges. And I can, I've shown in my work, and I can share it, is how planning is not at all what we know about planning. I mean, historically, we've been so interested and invested in explaining the violations in formality and implementation failure by actually staying in the position and the framework of the planning and the policy and the normative and the state. Now, the moment we actually re-theorize from the perspective of the violation, we don't see those frameworks actually at all available. They are entirely different. Now, the need of the hour to me is personally, rather than the implementation failure, and is explaining not just how policy is dead, but why policy itself is an impossibility in democracy. In its original word, not in its functional dictionary meaning, but in its original social life of the word as a reality, right? What was policy? Some people taking decisions, moving through these institution structures of perhaps bureaucracy, and only bureaucracy, of course. We don't consider anarchist organizations as policy, do we? Right? Etc.
Thank you for that.
Do you want to respond? I will.
Malini's got a hand up, so let's Malini, would you? And I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks. I actually inadvertently raised my hand, but I do think that what I thought it was very, very interesting to hear both your takes on temporality and policy. But I found it even more interesting to hear Jairaj's kind of take of what does it mean to take on the decolonial position, and then look at what all of this, working within, I mean, it's kind of rethinking the way we are functioning and the way we are looking at policy and the aims that are being applied to govern and to make things happen. So I think it's while one is constantly fighting with policy, and especially a policy which is spatial, most policy, at least what one has seen in India, is spatial, and regardless of its temporality, I think the fact that it's spatial has its own set of ramifications. And I mean, it's just a comment that I think and increasingly feel that really taking on a decolonial position, at least this is where I'm at, that there is a real need to restart and rethink all our efforts. I mean, whether it's planning or policy. I seriously, and feel that's where I was coming from. And just a small comment, I was somehow it would have been very, I mean, if you're thinking of doing this in future, I think sharing those papers beforehand or links in the poster would be very good, because I think it would also help us engage more with both your papers. Yeah, thank you.
So I take that, Malini, that point is a chastisement specifically to me. I had been tasked with making the papers available beforehand, and I didn't get round to it. So
eventful temporality. So.
Exactly, disrupted by the temporality of the real, as opposed to yeah. So I mean, my feeling around this is that the democratic politics in the post-colonial situation must also necessarily be a politics around institutions. 30 years of democracy in South Africa, I think the evidence is very, very strong that one of the great weaknesses of the democratic movement in South Africa is that it did not pay sufficient attention to the idea of building effective institutions, not efficient institutions, but effective institutions. There was, during the 1990s, there was some momentum in this regard, and I think the results were tremendous. In tax collection, for example, South African Revenue Services. But these are achievements which are unglamorous from the point of view of much of the humanities literature. They're unglamorous from a political point of view, especially because in South Africa they are strongly associated with kind of neoliberal interventions, which I disagree with very, very, very strongly. But I think during the 1990s in South Africa there was momentum around institution building. I think it came out of the momentum from the democratic struggles of the 1980s, which were very much, especially through the politics of the United Democratic Front, focused on bread and butter issues around providing water and electricity to people, reimagining or reorganizing spaces, thinking around democratic participation in government. So I think there was tremendous momentum in that regard. I think that momentum was interrupted. And especially around the focus that where there was focus on institutions, it was around a notion of transformation, which became essentially a focus on demographic transformation, racial change, rather than thinking around the engineering of the very composition or organizational processes of these organizations themselves. And therefore, so Jaharaj, I think your point about how these organizations reproduce themselves and reproduce their effects, I think is absolutely right, precisely because we weren't paying sufficient attention to the details of how these organizations worked. And I do think, therefore, just to reinforce the point, that if one is going to take seriously a democratic post-colonial politics, I do think we need to spend a lot of time thinking around the character of those institutions, the character of organizations, how one builds them, how one staffs them, how one organizes them, all this kind of apparently mundane, even boring, unglamorous work. I think that is fundamentally the work of decolonialism.
If I may, so I think to look at what you said, Jairaj, and also I'm trying to place all of this together, what your critique, Jairaj, Malini's point, and what I think the burden of our presentations, and certainly the common ground that we started with Ivor and I, and incidentally, we haven't had this conversation before. So this is really a conversation without any preparation at a conversation, a genuine conversation. So getting a sense of all of this, I think what I feel is, what I sense is really there are two different and related tables at which we are, or two domains in which are at stake. One is, and this is maybe very crude, but broadly, I think the focus on temporality is in many ways a focus on the formal dimension of policy. So it's at the start, it begins at the formal level, where we say that simply in the way we see the domain of policy, the composition of that domain, there is something missing in what we are looking at. And that's certainly where I began my inquiry, and that's really at the center of it. And that's also exactly the key thrust of Ivor's point. And in terms of content, there is what I see Ivor arguing really is the argument of effectiveness that comes with a particular kind of temporality, and that being obviously in a very kind of reasonable way connected to certain good democratic outcomes. But they are even Malini's argument about the aspatiality of policy is, and your argument about, say, the democratic and political content really that is embedded into the formal structure of policy because it was instituted in India, certainly through the colonial experience. I think it's clearly it works in both ways. They are two separate but related discussion, and they need to be, I think, conducted in both ways, both for their own sake, but also always in relation to these normative considerations. And I think there's a really productive investigation. I personally feel that it's possible to look at the formal in the temporal in terms of temporality, the formal dimension of institutions and policy within a decolonizing, decolonial agenda. I think the whole set of, which I don't know very well, but the anarchist experiments with organization and institutions, etc., would be something very, very fascinating. And I think nothing, at least in the way I can see this exercise, nothing in the way it's been set out prevents those kind of explorations. But that's a great point you brought up, Jairaj. I should have begun by saying that. Thanks.
Himanshu, on that note, we've come to the end.
Okay.
I think, I mean, this was a sort of an experimental event. I think the topic is fresh. I was, as I've said to you before, I was really thinking it was going to be you and I, and largely with ourselves. So I'm very grateful for the surprising and large turnout. So it also suggests to me that there's some interest in the topic, and I think it's probably something which we should discuss about how we take it forward. Perhaps something in the same spirit of other people wanting to contribute papers on temporality and policy making, and we have a similar sort of format going forward. But let us discuss that. Let us discuss this after this. From my point of view, thank you very, very much for initiating this, for reaching out on LinkedIn, and I'm very grateful again to be in touch.
Absolutely. So it was really a pleasure. Thank you everyone for turning up and for some great questions, Jairaj and Malini. And we hope to have more of this conversation in the future, perhaps in different ways as Ivor outlined. And Ivor, great to reconnect, and I hope we can take this ahead. Yeah.
Super.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good afternoon. Ciao.
Thank you. Bye.